Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Fires of Lust, Sex in the Middle Ages, by Katherine Harvey, narrated by Corrie James. Introduction. On 2 December 2015, in his speech opening a parliamentary debate on military action against the so-called Islamic State in Syria, the British Prime Minister David Cameron described the organisation's members as woman-raping, Muslim-murdering medieval monsters. This was not the first time he had identified Islamic State's use of sexual violence as something that belonged to a specific era in the distant past. A year earlier he had told the United Nations that the cruelty being meted out, beheadings, eyes being gouged out, rape is horrific. It is literally medieval in character. Cameron's identification of repugnant sexual behaviour as somehow medieval was far from an original sentiment. Rather, it sits within a long tradition of associating the Middle Ages with all the vices, also including superstition, torture, and poor personal hygiene, that we like to think we have subsequently become too good for. His comments encapsulate the popular perception that medieval life was backwards and unthinkingly violent, and that sex, rather than offering some respite from this unremitting bleakness, was usually violent, deviant, or both. All of these stereotypes have been oft represented and reinforced by the entertainment industry, and this prime ministerial version of our medieval past has much in common with the world depicted in the HBO television series Game of Thrones. While this immensely popular programme is technically a fantasy set in a fictional world, its creators have made much of its medieval inspiration and historical authenticity. When asked by The Atlantic about the sexual violence depicted in the series, George R.R. Martin, author of the novels on which it is based, responded, "Well, I'm not writing about contemporary sex. It's medieval." Such assertions have been used to justify the inclusion of countless sexual encounters and scenes involving numerous naked prostitutes, most of which add little or nothing to the plot or character development. This is a world in which sexual violence, including rape, is endemic, incest is unremarkable, and homosexuality is unnatural. Virtually every female character is sexually assaulted, some of them repeatedly, while the main gay character, Loris Tyrrell, is an effeminate and promiscuous man who is eventually executed for buggery. Stereotypical representations of medieval sex are also characteristic of the romance genre, as demonstrated by Mills and Boon's Medieval Lords and Ladies collection of historical novels. In comparison to Game of Thrones, these are rather gentle stories, but they are equally insistent that this was a violent world. Most of the heroes are warriors of some kind, in which women faced constant physical danger. While Mills and Boon has generally moved away from sexual violence in recent years, many of the encounters described in its medieval volumes are still very dependent on ideas of dominance and submission. Heroines are often reluctant to recognize their attraction to the hero and only realize their true feelings when they helplessly succumb to a combination of persistent harassment and rough sex. Such behaviour is rendered palatable by the formulaic nature of the books. The reader knows that there will be a happy ending, and that the heroine does love the hero really, but also by the distancing effect of several centuries. Like Game of Thrones, these novels use the Middle Ages as a device that allows the modern cultural consumer to observe behaviours which would feel uncomfortable if presented in a contemporary scenario, but which can be unchallenging, enjoyable, or even sexually gratifying if justified by the comfort blanket of history. Popular belief in the strange and violent nature of medieval sexuality is further reinforced by the persistent myth that medieval lords were entitled, through a custom known as the droit du seigneur, to take the virginity of a bride on her wedding night. Although there is no evidence that this ever happened in reality, it has been depicted in works as diverse as Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's opera The Marriage of Figaro, 1786, and the Hollywood blockbuster Braveheart, 1995. In the latter, Scottish animosity towards the English is partly driven by Edward I's decision to reimpose this custom north of the border. This new rite is enthusiastically embraced by the English commanders in Scotland, and leads indirectly to the death of William Wallace's beloved wife, and thus to his campaign against the English. It also serves to highlight the fundamental difference between the noble Scots and their English enemies, whose sexual deviance is represented not only by their enthusiasm for this brutal custom, but by Edward I's incestuous desire for his daughter-in-law Isabella, and by the homosexuality of his son Prince Edward, whose portrayal draws so heavily on contemporary stereotypes of gay men as weak, ineffectual and bitchy that it provoked protests at the time of the film's release, with one reviewer describing it as gay-baiting. Alongside the conviction that all medieval sex was deeply deviant and or violently misogynistic, there exists another strongly entrenched belief, that everyone in the Middle Ages was sexually repressed, thanks to the influence of the Church, but also sex-mad. This idea is even included, in a very tame way, in the popular children's television series Horrible Histories, in which the title characters in the Funky Monk song declare that for a monk to stick true to his vows, he must live a life of no fun. As soon as the bishop's back is turned, they eat, drink, and smuggle in a nun. More overtly, this idea is used as a source of humour in a number of films that employ another persistent medieval myth, the chastity belt. This device was supposedly used by jealous husbands to prevent their wives having adulterous relations while they were away from home, although there is little evidence that this was either a widespread problem or a real solution. Nevertheless, it has featured prominently in films such as Up the Chastity Belt, 1971, in which Frankie Howerd played Lurkalot, a seller of marital aids. The film is essentially a series of comic set pieces, including one in which Lurkalot sells a chastity belt to a husband who is about to go on crusade, only to turn around and sell keys to a whole crowd of men. In another scene, he makes chastity belts for Saladin's harem so that they can go on a sex strike and end the crusades, which are presented largely as a getaway for bored husbands who want some sexual freedom. Representations of this sort ridicule medieval attitudes and highlight the differences between the past and the present, but are underpinned by a belief that medieval people were just like us, because ultimately sex is a universal human impulse. Yet while there are some obvious continuities, not least because the human body and its physical capabilities have changed very little over the past millennium, there have been significant changes in how sex has been regarded, and therefore in how it is understood and experienced. For one thing, the medieval mind tended to see sex as something that one person did to another, rather than an activity in which both partners were equally engaged. There was a strong tendency to emphasize active, implicitly male, and passive, female, roles, and to assume that one of each was involved in each act of intercourse. While this did not necessarily mean that medieval women were expected to simply lie back and think of England, it was considered significant that men did the penetrating and women were penetrated. This way of thinking held true even in discussions of same-sex acts, so that one man would be considered passive and the other active. Female-to-female acts were only really considered as sex if one woman used an object to penetrate the other. If this view tended to prioritize penile vaginal intercourse as the most significant, perhaps the only real, form of sex, the picture was further complicated by the existence of different categorizations of sexuality and sexual behavior. We should not automatically assume that what seems sexual to us seems sexual to them, or vice versa. In contemporary Britain, for example, kissing someone on the lips is almost inherently sexual, to the extent that some people object even to a parent kissing their young child on the mouth. But while medieval kisses certainly could be erotic, they could also be an expression of affection, or respect, or political bonds. Heterosexuality and homosexuality are both essentially 19th century inventions. To apply either term to the pre-modern world is anachronistic, and arguably distorts our understanding of the past. Consequently, some historians have argued we may need different categorizations, perhaps natural versus unnatural, licit versus illicit, or virginity versus everything else, to think about medieval sex. Besides the ideological differences between medieval and modern views of sex, it is worth considering the differences in how people learn about sex. Today, by the time we reach the age of consent, most of us will have acquired considerable knowledge from formal sex education, but also via exposure to our sex-saturated mass media, from, for example, news stories, advertising, sex scenes in films and on television, and perhaps even pornography. In contrast, most medieval people encountered only what could be gleaned from their local community, whether in the form of instruction from a parish priest, conversation with family and friends, or occasional glimpses of people or animals caught in the act. Of course, there is a vast array of sexual attitudes and experience in the modern world, so that your perspective and mine might be very different, and the same was true in medieval Europe. This book focuses on Western Europe, a sizable area encompassing a range of peoples, cultures and attitudes over a period of roughly 4 centuries, from circa 1100 to around 1500. Given such a geographical and chronological range, as well as the influence of individual circumstances, experiences and personalities, there would have been considerable variation in what people thought about sex and sexuality, and we should be cautious about trying to identify one single medieval view on any of the topics covered. Nevertheless, there were some extremely influential and widely shared ideas and attitudes in circulation, many of them rooted in 2 belief systems that were dominant throughout medieval Europe: Roman Catholic Christianity and Galenic medicine. It is with the influence of these complex ideologies on medieval sex and sexuality that we shall begin. 1. Guiding Principles. Although sexual intercourse is, in essence, a bodily function, individual attitudes and experiences are always shaped by the world in which one lives, by legal constraints, by medical ideas, and in many societies, including medieval Europe, by religious beliefs. Religious beliefs. In the tiny parish church of St. Botolph's, Hardham, West Sussex, is a quartet of 12th century wall paintings that tell the story of Adam and Eve. In the best preserved, the first man and woman are unashamedly naked. Then Eve succumbs to the temptation, represented by a strange winged serpent. The other images depict the couple after the fall, performing agricultural tasks, immersing themselves in water to quell their newly emerged lust, and finally, cowering in shame, hiding their nakedness with their arms. This familiar Bible story was at the heart of medieval understandings of sex. Before the fall, Adam and Eve represented human nature as it was meant to be. They were immortal and free from suffering, and their sinless bodies functioned perfectly. After the fall, everything changed. As the early 13th century English treatise Holy Maidenhood put it, "If you ask why God created such a thing, as sex, this is my answer. God never created it to be like this, but Adam and Eve perverted it through their sin and corrupted our nature. Such was the importance of this process that the nature of sex in the Garden of Eden was the subject of considerable theological debate. Some authorities argued that prelapsarian people would have reproduced asexually, like angels, but this was very much a minority view. Most theologians thought that God designed sexual intercourse as a means of perpetrating the human and animal races, and that he created sexual pleasure as an added incentive to the fulfillment of this goal. It was, however, generally agreed that Adam and Eve did not have sex in paradise, either because there was insufficient time before the fall, or because God did not order them to do so. Nevertheless, medieval people were fascinated by the possibility of prelapsarian sex, and debated what it would have been like. Some argued that it would have been completely free of both sin and pleasure, with the genitals functioning like any other body part. Having an erection would have felt no different to moving an arm or leg. Others thought that sex would have been more pleasurable before the fall, when bodies were both healthier and more sensitive. However, because these perfect people were untroubled by lust, they would have had sex only in order to reproduce, with every act of intercourse producing healthy offspring. Related physiological puzzles were also much discussed. It was, for example, deemed unlikely that Eve would have menstruated, or that Adam would have experienced wet dreams, since their bodies were perfectly calibrated. Some even suggested that semen would not have existed in paradise. Hildegard of Bingen, 1098 to 1179, thought that men would instead have produced some sort of pureness. Others disagreed, reasoning that Adam and Eve could not have obeyed God's command to be fruitful and multiply without it. If many aspects of sex before and after the fall were unknowable, the increased role played by shame was unquestionable. In a post-lapsarian world, sex was irrevocably altered. The events that took place in Eden transformed a simple bodily function into something disruptive and uncontrollable. People were embarrassed by their oversensitive genitals, which were no longer obedient to reason. More troublingly, sex became the means by which original sin was transmitted. Because sex was impossible without lust, children who were conceived through intercourse inevitably received this taint. These facts coloured all medieval discussions about sex. St. Augustine, 354 to 430, whose writings were widely read throughout the Middle Ages, thought that all sex was sinful because it inverted the proper hierarchy of mind and body and caused, through orgasm, an almost total extinction of mental alertness. It thus served as a reminder of, perhaps even a partial reenactment of, the original sin which led to the fall. Such sentiments informed many of the texts that seem to suggest that the medieval church disapproved, wholeheartedly and without nuance, of any form of sexual activity. For example, according to the Quinque Verba, a 14th-century manual for the instruction of priests, lust is the seventh deadly sin, and lust means the desire for illicit pleasures in many forms, such as fornication, whoring, adultery, debauchery, incest, sacrilege, unnatural vices, and other horrendous sins. Still, it is not a good thing to dwell on these things or speak of them at too great a length, but rather to grieve over and fear them. The reason for such fear was explained by a 12th-century English sermon, which proclaimed that bodily pleasure is but for a moment, but the fire which follows thereon will endure forever. The surest way to avoid hellfire was to remain a virgin. According to Holy Maidenhood, which was written to persuade holy women of the benefits of virginity, the best sexual deterrent was meditation on that sinful act through which your mother conceived you, that indecent heat of the flesh, that burning itch of physical desire, that animal union, that shameless coupling, that stinking and wanton deed full of filthiness. Marriage was, the author claimed, the least meritorious of the 3 states in which a Christian might honestly live. For marriage brings forth her fruit 30-fold in heaven, widowhood 60-fold, maidenhood with 100-fold outdoes both. Being a virgin placed a woman, or indeed a man, on the level of the angels, or perhaps even above them, since it was harder to remain pure on earth than it was in heaven. Indeed, given that being a true virgin meant avoiding not just sex with a partner, but masturbation and even impure thoughts, it is surprising that any mere mortal achieved it. The scale of the challenge is illustrated by the case of an unfortunate young monk who was persecuted by a demon. Whenever he began to pray, the evil spirit rubbed his genitals until he was polluted by an emission of semen. Although the man was otherwise of good behaviour, Bishop Hildegard of Le Mans, 1096 to 1125, ruled that he was no longer a virgin, since he had participated, however unwillingly, in a shameful act of fornication. Yet despite the clarity of this verdict, and despite holy maidenhood's assertion that virginity was a treasure that, if it be once lost, will never again be found, many authorities suggested that virginity could be regained. St. Augustine believed that the will was central in such cases. If a woman had not experienced desire, then her spiritual virginity was intact, even if her body was not. According to Peter Damian, circa 1007 to 1072, those who questioned God's ability to restore virginity, either physical or spiritual, were guilty of questioning his power. If, Damian fumed, God could be born of a virgin, then of course he could achieve the much lesser feat of repairing lost virginity. For pious women who longed for the religious life, but were obliged to marry, such arguments offered the possibility of salvation. The Norfolk mystic Margery Kempe, circa 1373 to circa 1438, a married mother of 14, who was tormented by her lost virginity, received the ultimate proof that sex did not have to signal the end of a woman's spiritual life when she tearfully bewailed her fallen state to Christ, with whom she regularly conversed. He reassured her that because she was a maiden in her soul, she would dance alongside the holy virgins in heaven. Thanks to Adam and Eve, the idea that sex was sinful influenced all medieval lives. Nevertheless, most people opted for marriage over virginity, and unlike Margery Kempe, most do not seem to have felt like failures. Nor should we assume that those who took wedding vows were automatically seen as inferior to those who took vows of celibacy. Marital sex, if performed correctly, was not seen as a barrier to salvation, and by the later Middle Ages, the Church was increasingly willing to acknowledge that it could even be a good thing. It saved the souls of those who were incapable of lifelong abstinence and produced Christian offspring. Moreover, as the English friar John Baconthorpe, circa 1290 to 1347, observed, marriage had wider benefits, for man does not just aim at generating offspring for the multiplication of the species like a beast. He aims at living a good and peaceful life with his wife. How far the ordinary Christian absorbed and was influenced by these ideas is largely unknowable, but Fasciculus Morum, an early 14th-century English handbook for preachers, reveals the moral messages delivered from the pulpit. Churchgoers were, for example, taught that lechery was offensive to God and pleasing to the devil. They were also reminded that great care must be taken over even seemingly harmless physical contact and conversations, since lust was like a fire and could be ignited by a spark. Such general teachings were supplemented by warnings about specific forms of sexual sin, including fornication, which was a grave sin because it could never be justified, unlike, say, theft in time of need, because it suggested that humans were worse than animals, some of which mated for life, and because it caused social disorder, for if everybody could freely sleep with anyone, frequent struggles would arise, strife, hatred, homicide, and many more evils. The married faithful were also warned against infidelity, and reminded that husbands must not become adulterers with their own wives, using sex not for procreation, but for their lustful pleasures alone. Finally, parishioners were taught about incest and sodomy, even though the latter was so repulsive that the author could not bring himself to discuss it, simply writing that, "I pass over it in horror and leave it to others to describe it." The moral instruction of the medieval Christian also covered chastity, which in this context meant sexual restraint within or without marriage, rather than complete abstinence. It was achieved through a combination of self-control and self-mortification, such as fasting or flagellation. The message was reinforced with purportedly true tales of continence, including one about a man who suffered from bad breath. When he asked his wife why she had not told him, she replied that she thought that all men's mouths smell that way. This proved that she was a truly chaste wife who had never kissed another man. Preachers also praised virginity as the ideal state, warning that it could be lost through unchaste touching and hugging, and reminding their flock that, as a sign of his love and reverence of virginity, Christ chose to be a virgin, to be born of a virgin, and to be baptized by a virgin. Those who imitated his life of exemplary sexual purity would follow Christ to the kingdom of heaven. Such exhortations to emulate Christ were common in medieval Christianity. He, along with the saints, was constantly held up as an example of pious living, to be imitated by the faithful. It was in this spirit that Bishop Herbert of Norwich, 1090 to 1119, wrote to Thurston, the monk, "My son, see to it that you maintain your chastity, without which it is impossible to please God. A virgin was Christ, a virgin was Mary, the mother of Christ, a virgin was John, the herald of Christ, a virgin was John, the beloved of Christ. Attend, and you shall find that everywhere in the mystery of our redemption virginity has the utmost efficacy. Truly it is a blessed fellowship to dwell with Christ, and to sing the song which none but virgins sing." Such an exhortation was particularly appropriate in this context, since both men had taken monastic vows, but interest in such models of sexual conduct was not limited to the cloister. From the 12th century onwards, there was both growing interest in the humanity of Jesus and the saints, and an increasing tendency for the devout to try to emulate them. Since virginity has always been particularly valued as a feminine virtue, it is unsurprising that it was particularly associated with female saints, to the extent that some historians have argued that it was almost impossible for a non-virginal woman to be considered truly holy. The most obvious embodiment of this ideal was the Virgin Mary, to whom many medieval Christians of both sexes were passionately devoted. It was widely believed that she remained a virgin after the conception and birth of Christ, and indeed for her entire life. Some even suggested that she had been impregnated by a ray of pure light, possibly through the ear. There was a strong desire to separate the virgin from not only the indignities of sexual intercourse, but the related contaminations of the female body, so that it was widely believed that the birth of Christ was free from pain and from the polluting effects of afterbirth. Some authorities suggested that thanks to her immaculate conception, Mary would not have menstruated. Although Mary was preeminent among the medieval virgin saints, she had numerous popular counterparts, notably the Virgin Martyrs. These Roman girls were the heroines of highly formulaic tales, in which they converted to Christianity against the wishes of their pagan families, and died in defence of their faith and their virginity, often after undergoing extreme physical and mental trials. One of the best known was St. Agnes, a 13-year-old girl who faced torments, including imprisonment in a brothel and a miraculously unsuccessful burning, before she was eventually stabbed to death. Moreover, such powerfully disturbing stories were not confined to the history books.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?